Okay. Welcome, everyone. So welcome to the Sustainability and Environmental Action Special Interest Group Symposium. So I'm Neil Duncan, I'm the Secretary of the SIG, and this is Maria Majura. So I'm standing in for Charlotte Ray, the chair, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. I just wanted to acknowledge her work and the work of Winson Yang, who are the people who really organised all this symposium. So just wanted to thank them for their hard work. So it's wonderful to see so many people here that are interested in the question of how we, as brain mappers, work to combat the climate crisis that we're living through. And I think the vital importance of this question has become more and more apparent over recent years as we see the planet change around us. But as brain mappers, I think we're in a good position to do something about this. The OHBM is a uniquely multidisciplinary society, which means that we are able to contact other fields and together drive collective action in order to change things. And changing things is what we're going to talk about today. So we've got 4 wonderful speakers who are going to talk to us about things that we can actually do to try and improve the situation. So before we start, I just want to remind everyone to post your questions through the app. We've got 2 speakers today who are walking the walk, so to speak, and they're attending virtually, so no carbon footprint for them. But that means they're going to try and respond to your questions in real time, but give your questions as early as possible so that they've got a chance to type out their answers. And I'll try and leave some time at the end to catch up on any responses that we maybe miss throughout the session. Okay, so without any more chat from me, our first speaker is going to be Samira Epp from the Technical University of Munich, who will be presenting some work that she's been doing looking at the carbon pollution that has resulted from prior OHBM conferences. So, Sam, please.
Okay, yes, you can hear me. Hello, everyone. It's really my great pleasure to participate in this year's symposium on how neuroscientists can tackle the climate crisis. And also, thanks a lot for the organization, and also, again, thanks to Charlotte Ray, who couldn't be here with us today. My name is Samira Epp, and I'm actually a neuroscientist by training, but today I will be speaking as a member of the Sustainability and Environmental Action Special Interest Group here at the OHBM. And I will tell you something about how we can reduce the climate costs of the OHBM and what our vision is for a more sustainable meeting. And you will also get a glimpse into our soon-to-be published paper where we analyzed some data. I can take off my mask, sorry. So, where we analyzed some data of past OHBM meetings. But first of all, why should we even reduce carbon emissions? I think that most of you probably know these warming stripes by climate scientist Ed Hawkins. And I think they are a great visualization, I also have them here, a visualization of the variation in global temperatures from a 30-year reference period. And they're simply, in a very simple way, showing that it is getting warmer and warmer, and it's doing so with a very high speed, actually. And we also know that the burning of fossil fuels is responsible for this current warming, and that is also what is shown in the newest IPCC report. So they showed again that we are already in the warmest multi-century period in more than 100,000 years, and that atmospheric CO2 concentrations have never been as high in the last 2 million years. So what is the IPCC? It's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body of the UN, and it regularly reviews scientific evidence related to climate change. And it also in these latest reports that were published this year and last year, over 700 scientists worked together And they also state that the sea level will rise of about 0.5 to 1 meter by 2100. And we know that this is a great problem because a lot of people are living close by the sea. And it is, for example, estimated that by 2050, up to 13.3 million of Bangladeshis may become displaced due to climate change. So it's a huge problem, and we also will be seeing a rise in extreme weather events, as the one we have been seeing in India this spring. So the heat wave in India is estimated to occur every 3 to 10 years now, and it used to occur every 300 years. So we really see a large increase in these extreme weather events. So we have to acknowledge all in all that the high speed of warming makes adaptation nearly impossible, also because nearly half of the world's population is actually highly vulnerable to climate change. But of course, we could still ask, why should we reduce carbon emissions? And I think it becomes pretty clear if we look at the historical cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. And here we see that North America and Europe emitted the most. And we also know that the members of the OHBM and also the attendees come mostly from North America and Europe. So I think that makes it pretty clear where our responsibility comes from. And we are seeing that global warming is already affecting people in the here and now, mostly in the global south. And to prevent worst case scenarios and tipping points from where there's actually no return, we have to drastically cut back our emissions. But we are unfortunately quite far away from doing so. So we are still emitting globally every year more and more greenhouse gas emissions, which you can also see here in in this red path here. So the trend from implemented policies is still an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. But we really have to drastically cut them down. So we really have to be either on the blue or on the green path. The blue path limits warming to 1.5 degrees, as it was agreed in the Paris Agreement, or as it's the target in the Paris Agreement. And the green path would limit warming to 2 degrees. Yes, but we are, as I said, we are still far from doing that. It would really require to cut back emissions globally, starting now, basically. And this brings me also back to our responsibility and the responsibility of the OHBM. Oh, I forgot some comments that are also in the IPCC. So actually, what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, delay means death in this case, and it literally means so for a lot of people, because we are running out of ways to adapt to the climate crisis. That's what the new report shows. But it also shows that individuals with high socioeconomic status, and I think that most of us are individuals with high socioeconomic status, they contribute disproportionately to emissions and also have the highest potential for emissions reductions as citizens, investors, consumers, role models, and professionals. And this actually brings me back to our responsibility and the responsibility of the OHBM. So how much did we actually emit on past conferences? And I think first of all, we have to acknowledge that aviation or travel to a conference is really the single biggest CO2 equivalent emitter. I calculated it for the Rome meeting. So here, approximately 97% of the emissions were due to aviation or travel to the conference. And all in all, we emitted a lot, between 8,000 and 14,000 tons. So, for example, in Honolulu, we emitted over 14,000 tons. This is as much as 23,800 inhabitants of Bangladesh emit on average per year. So it's really huge. And we also see that the total emissions and the emissions per person vary a lot. So here are always the total emissions from the conference, and here are the emissions per person. And the emissions depend, of course, on the total number of people that were attending, but also crucially on the percentage of super long-haul flights that have to be taken. And this is also shown on the next slide. Yes, where I compared the Singapore emissions, or the emissions from a meeting in Singapore, to the emissions in Rome. And here on, you can always see the number of attendees here on this axis, and the emissions on the in the lower part from Singapore compared to Rome. You can see that nearly double of the attendees in Rome compared to the Singapore meeting. But you also see that the emissions per person vary a lot. So in Singapore it was around 5 tons per person. In Rome it was around 3.15 tons per person. And this is because actually most people had to fly or had to take super long haul or long haul flights to Singapore. Super long haul flights are always in red and long haul flights are in yellow. And for a Rome meeting, it's becoming pretty clear. So here, 45% of the attendees had to take super long-haul flights and emitted 89% of the total emissions. And the other 45% of attendees that were able to take short-haul flights, for example, or car, train, or buses, they only emitted 6% of the total emissions. So that means that the percentage of super long-haul flights matters a lot for total and for per person emissions. And this also means that the location of the meeting is crucial, but it does actually not only matter in terms of environmental considerations, but also in terms of inclusivity and diversity, of course. And in these graphs here, we see that most of our attendees are coming from the Northern Hemisphere. But we also see that people chose to attend or not to attend based on the location of the meeting. So it's not only environmental considerations that prevent people from coming, it's also, for example, limited funding, travel restrictions, or care work why people choose to not attend. And what is really interesting here, so the first bar is always the United States, and then usually comes either UK, Canada, Germany, or China sometimes. And in the case of China, we had no person from China at the Vancouver meeting. This is probably due to travel restrictions. I don't know for sure, but I assume that it was due to travel restrictions. While at this meeting in Singapore, we had 400 attendees from China. So we draw 2 main conclusions from this. First of all, a fully hybrid meeting is really important to those who cannot travel due to various restrictions, but also, for example, for smaller labs or undergraduate students which do not have sufficient funding. This will probably also increase overall attendance, because what you see here, for example, at the online meeting 2020, we had an increase in total attendees, but the numbers especially increased for people attending from the United States, Canada, UK. So probably we have a lot of undergraduate students or just people without funding who also in these countries can't afford to come to the meeting. So a hybrid meeting is important, but also it's important to meet in person, of course. So we vote actually for an alternative hub model instead of a single hub meeting, so that everybody can choose to travel to a nearby location without having to travel long haul or long distance. So a hub approach means that instead of one single meeting location, you have different hubs, for example, 3 different hubs where you can choose to travel to. And apart from increasing inclusivity and diversity, the different alternative options also save a lot of emissions. So for example, if we go from a fully in-person meeting to a hybrid meeting, where only 1/3 of the people who otherwise would travel super long haul choose to attend online, it already saves 1/3 of the total emissions. And then, for example, a biennial meeting where you meet every second year, of course, saves 50% of emissions. And here, this yearly hybrid multi-hub option, which is a hybrid meeting in 3 different hubs, saves a staggering 79% of total emissions. So overall, so this is what the CSIC think. So we think that there is no way around fully hybrid. And we also think that the multi-hub model will substantially reduce long-haul flights. while still allowing to meet in person. And so overall, we might even end with increased overall attendance and hopefully increased diversity while substantially reducing our climate impact. And if you ask yourself now, what can I do? I think the most important thing is to join forces. This is also where the fun begins, because you can, of course, join one of our working groups. We have 3 different working groups here at the CSIC, the annual meeting group, the neuroimaging research pipelines group, the education and outreach group. We are searching for members. You can visit our website or reach out through Twitter. But of course, there are also other groups, as Scientists for Future, or your university or research center might already have a group where you can join, or you can also bring the people together there and establish such a group. And I think it's really also important to demand action from policymakers. I mean, we have to change something on the systems level. I think individual action is not really enough, because we agreed on the 1.5 degree target in Paris, but as you have seen, like, implemented policies are far away from that. And if you really want to change something on the individual scale, which has the most impact, it's really to reduce flying if you still do so, or even to stop flying. As hard as it sounds, but it really has most of the impact. For example, if you fly from here to Australia, you already emit 10 tons of CO2. Yeah, you can hardly beat that by anything else. And if you travel, do this more mindfully. Really choose where you really want to travel to. Is it really necessary? And then it's also really important to talk with family, friends, and colleagues, because we have to get the word out there. Yes, and because we see that the implications from climate science and related fields really impact the way we are living, we will live, and also the way we will be able to do our own research, actually. And I think, like, the climate science community is really publishing warning after warning, and the time is running out for adaptation, and also to avoid worst-case scenarios. And I still personally have the feeling that most of us are just like in our own comfortable bubble doing our own research, and we don't really care about the science or the research implications of our fellow climate scientists. And I think we really have to know better. We need to know better, because we as scientists, we understand effects and implications, and we have to act as role models. And so the bottom line from my talk now is really to let's all be role models, basically, and start collective action. So it would be great if you join me there. And thanks a lot for listening. Actually, tomorrow at 8 a.m., we will be discussing about the future of the OHBM, because, of course, we also want to know what the members think, what they want. And huge thanks also to Charlotte Ray and the organization for this symposium. And thanks you for listening.
Thanks, Sam. I think we've got time for one question, if
Yes.
you're okay with that. So some really useful information there. The question we got here is, when you were calculating your carbon emissions and the relative carbon emissions of different models, did you take into account the emissions from servers and so on for running online functions?
So yes, but the thing is, like, they are really minimal compared to the Aviation and Travel Tour Conference. There has been this recent paper where they state that basically they are not even 1% of the total emissions when you compare them to an in-person meeting. So I think we don't really have to take them into account, actually, at least not for the online meeting. I mean, for example, Simon will also talk about, like, heavy computing. I think that's something different, but for the meetings, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to our first online speaker, which will be Park Wild from Tufts University, who will be introducing the Flying Less initiative. So if you could play the video, please.
Hello. I'm so glad to have this chance to talk about opportunities for academic communities to reduce flying while preserving their effectiveness, as part of this symposium on initiative neuroscientists can take to tackle the climate crisis. There's several moving parts relevant to understanding how the field of research on human brain mapping and neuroscience can change in light of the climate crisis. As part of this session, we'll enjoy hearing from Dr. Epp on how aviation emissions for conferences such as this one on human brain mapping can be reduced. We'll hear from Dr. Medawar on the climate impact of the food system and also food aspects of academic conferencing. And we'll hear from Dr. Hoffman on another emission sector addressing the climate impact of our research computational infrastructure. My talk connects these conversations in a single sector to the broader transformation initiative in university and research communities nationally and internationally. By research profession, I am, and I say this with a little trepidation because I'm worried you're going to think, why did we invite him to our conference? But I am an agricultural economist. I'm not even a brain scientist. So I feel especially privileged to be included in a spirit of interdisciplinary collaboration on climate action. I'm here to tell you about the Flying Less initiative, which I'm a co-organizer along with Joe Nevins of Vassar College. And our website has a number of features, including a blog and also a petition. The petition encourages people who support it not necessarily to stop flying themselves, but to support a strategic vision of institutional change. The planks of the petition platform include asking universities and institutions of higher education to include all of their university-related flying in their environmental impact measurement, to support virtual conferencing, to set ambitious goals for emissions reduction, and to use their influence with professional associations and funders to reduce the need for flying and to promote alternatives to flying. Along with that aspect of the petition targeting universities and university and research institutions, there's also an aspect focused on academic and professional associations, research funders, and more of an individual change aspect about what is going to be your change in your own professional practice. But you can see that the individual aspect is optional. You can choose as a petition signer which of these you want to support, and you don't have to support all of them. And the individual aspect is just one piece of the puzzle in a vision that's actually more strategic. The resources tab on this website describes other organizations doing wonderful work, such as the Youthful Explain initiative, which it describes how universities can be transformed. The Stay Grounded initiative, which has a special focus on climate justice and aviation. The Tyndall Center for Climate Research, which over the years has had from time to time a big focus on aviation and currently has a new document and set of support materials on aviation and university and research communities. And the newer Flying Less initiative in Germany, which shares a name with my own initiative, and describes how universities in Europe can change in response to the climate crisis. We also have a frequently asked questions tab. For example, it's got information. There's a good deal of misunderstanding of the greenhouse gas consequences of different modes of transportation. The wonderful Barry Saxifrage graphic, he was willing to modify it in response to some of the conversation with our initiative recently, and it sort of describes, as you look horizontally and move to the right, how many kilometers or how many miles do you get per unit of greenhouse gas emissions? So further to the right is all the great electric forms of transportation, and further to the left, and especially the lower left, is the fossil fuel transportation, and you can see aviation is in the lower left-hand corner. Let's zoom in a little on that lower left-hand corner. Part of the misinformation about this is sometimes you'll see comparisons that I find a little bit misleading between automobiles with one person and flying. It is true that if you use a traditional fossil fuels automobile, such as an SUV, and you only have one person in it, that the miles per gallon or miles per unit of fuel isn't really all that much better than flying. But I think that's a little besides the point. It's like, congratulations, you found the one mode of transportation that's as bad as flying. In fact, when you think about it in the big picture, the use of any automobile, if you're carrying more than one person in it, is a much better way of getting from place to place. And in the big picture, if you look at buses among fossil fuel transportation, and then among all the electric options, and you're getting many, many more kilometers per unit of greenhouse gas emitted. But perhaps for many of us, the issue is not really technical. It's not really that we don't know about the greenhouse gas emissions from different forms of transportation. It's that we have some skepticism about whether we could really incorporate this into a thriving research community. I recently contributed to an article in Lancet Planetary Health with colleagues at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. They organized every year for a number of years a major conference internationally on agriculture, nutrition, and health that was held particularly in low and lower middle income countries, especially with an eye towards making sure that it was accessible to scholars outside of the United States and Western Europe. And the conference, like many conferences, had to shift to an online mode due to the pandemic in 2020. And so you can see that we tracked the aviation emissions from the different years of participation in the conference. And of course, the aviation emissions plummeted to zero for the year that the conference was moved online. But the thing on all of your minds, I'm quite sure, is that sure, the aviation emissions can plummet, but what is the trade-off? What is the loss in terms of access and participation? But the number of participants during the online year actually increased, and in particular, it increased for participants in low and lower middle income countries. And so let's reflect on this. If we were expecting to be measuring what is the trade-off, what is the loss from the greener option that might have lower participation, but quite the contrary, we found that participation and environmental merit pulled in the same direction. Now, you might quite reasonably be saying to yourself, yeah, okay, that's fine for number of participants, but what about the quality of participation? Can we really build the human connection that we need as part of a research community if we don't have access to the ability to meet over coffee or the ability to meet at a wine reception that we so particularly enjoy at the academic conference? The issue may not be about numbers of participants, but loss of personal connection. It really is true, for example, that in online communication, we lose the delight and sense of place that comes from the location that we're traveling to. But the in-person conferencing also does leave people out for reasons having to do with economics and gender roles and parenting, and there's a number of reasons why the in-person conferencing that we enjoyed was not really a form of environmental justice for all participants in our research system. But also, I wonder if with a little imagination, we can perhaps do better in online communication in communicating the personality and sense of place in the location that we're broadcasting from, and thereby learn a little more about what's going on in each other's lives and the settings that we're coming from. In academic presentation, we may be in the most wonderful cities, but our in-person presentations tend to be in homogeneous conference center rooms with the same podiums and the same PowerPoint projectors. Here, in this video, at least you can see I'm in my office and I'm doing a little to communicate a sense of place with the poster of Boston transportation over my shoulder. But that's just a start. As long as the OHBM is having this presentation in video format, let's see if we can convert a limitation of online communication into a strength by grabbing my GoPro camera here and sharing something more personal about the neighborhood surrounding my office.
My office on Tufts University's Boston campus is in the Chinatown neighborhood of Boston. Here on Washington Avenue is my favorite place to see Broadway musicals. Behind me here is the Old South Meeting House, where 18th century patriots planned the American Revolution and independence from the United Kingdom on democratic and Republican principles. The hotel behind me here is the Omni Parker House. In 1912, Ho Chi Minh was a baker here, decades before he became leader of the National Liberation Movement in Vietnam. And Malcolm Little worked here in the 1940s as a busboy, many years before he became Malcolm X. As I walk across the Boston Common back to my office, the gold-domed building behind me is the Massachusetts State Capitol.
You can see that in this video presentation, you already have more of a sense of the context that the speaker comes from than you would have if I were standing in front of a podium. This little short video, which illustrates some of the potential, is just one example of a broader set of capabilities that I think we could exploit more than we do. On our website for the Flying Less Initiative, there's also a gently satirical video series, a sort of a mock travel and tourism show called Lifestyles of the Not Jet Set. Here's an example of a clip.
Welcome to Lifestyles of the Not Jet Set, the travel and tourism show that's conducting a very personal experiment to see whether an academic career necessarily tanks the moment the person involved decides to stop flying. I'm here today in Austin, Texas. You could probably tell by the iconic statue of the cowboy by Constance Warren. Sometimes I feel like a time traveler who simultaneously, by traveling more slowly, has the power to look backwards in time with a stronger vision of what life was like for people there, and time travel forward in time to a period maybe a couple decades from now, maybe sooner, I hope, when our society has taken account of the climate crisis that we face and made adjustments to our transportation system that are appropriate. In which case, there will be much more people doing this strange thing that I'm currently doing in traveling by train to professional conferences.
I don't want to exaggerate. It's not like zero flying is the appropriate amount for academic and research communities. The question is about the overall quantity. Sometimes people respond to our Flying Less initiative by feeling the sense of loss of the flights that they find most valuable. But of course, those are not the ones that are going to be reduced first. Ask yourself about what is the possibility of reducing the flights that had less value, both for our academic careers and for our personal and global connections. For example, the long trips that we take away from family for 10-minute presentations of secondary career value, when we might have even better spent our time at home writing and accomplishing more value in our work. I'm so glad that the Organization for Human Brain Mapping and that the field of neuroscience is taking up this conversation. There's a long list of objections that people make, for example, that flying is essential for cross-cultural contact, or that flying is essential even for a sense of revolutionary spirit and social change. There's a little bit of truth to each of these points, but I think even in the walk through the neighborhood here in Boston surrounding my office, you get a sense of how connected a person can feel, both to cross-cultural contact and to a sense of revolutionary change in history. During the time of crisis, during one of these key points of decision for our society, these are the big issues that are on our mind. I hope that you enjoy your conference this week and have wonderful conversations with each other. If you feel inspired and connected to the message of this video, I hope you will sign up for the petition and share it with your colleagues. You can find it on our website at flyingless.org.
I feel a bit boring following that. There's been a few questions, and rightly so, I think, about the implications of flying less on access for people from the global south and lower income countries. I think Professor Wild provided some compelling answers to those questions in his video there. And he also follows up in the chat, where he points out that the majority of flying is done by a relatively small number of senior academics in North America and Europe, and so there's perhaps changing those behaviours would not impact people from other parts of the world so much.
And I would also just say that the Diversity and Inclusivity Committee is working really hard to make sure that any alternative conference models address those concerns, and they do a great job of listening to the concerns of people from those countries and also people from the OHBM community. So if you have any ideas or opportunities to share, they have a lot of outlets for you to do so. Do we have any more time for a question?
I think we've got time for one more. Sorry, we're just trying to think.
Sam, I was just wondering if you could speak. I think some people are concerned that maybe our concerns as a SIG won't be heard. I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the impact that we've already had on OHBM as a SIG and such a baby SIG, if you will.
So, can you, sorry,
Sure. Oh, yeah. So what have we done as a SIG, and what impact have we already had on the OHBM community?
So I think we try at least work also together with the diversity and inclusivity special interest group to really address these concerns. And we, at least what I heard also from council, is that they are considering alternative meeting options. I think it was perhaps also like our push, because we really think that it is important. It's not, of course, not clear yet where we will move to. The next 3 years are already fixed because they already booked the conference centers, etc. But I think there will be a really interesting discussion on where we will move to what form, also considering all other aspects, not only environmental considerations. And yes, and I think do you want to add something?
I would just say that, we've put together a number of surveys for the OHBM community, and council has been really responsive to them, and it allowed us to send them out, and has been very responsive in listening to the things that we have to say, and made sure that our communications as a SIG are heard and spread around to the general OHBM community. And I feel like we definitely are making an impact, especially with some of the important analyses that you just presented.
Oh, that is right. I wanted to add that it's really interesting also to collect more data on the people who are attending, also like on like, are they graduate students, undergraduate students, senior scientists, where are they coming from, also their agenda, if they want to reply to that, of course. So to really see who is coming, when it's online, who's attending hybrid, the online option. Do we have to do some incentives for those in underrepresented countries so that they can still meet in person? So I personally, I'm not, because there was also this question, I think that we should actively encourage people from underrepresented countries or also low-income countries to come as an OHBM. So I don't think that these flights should be cut. I think really that's the flights of like more northern hemispheric people who are already privileged should be cut. So yeah.
Okay, I'll give one last answer from Professor Park. He's online just now and he's giving answers to all the questions on the app, so do please take a look and see what he's got to say. But someone asked, does carbon offsetting help anything, or is it just a drop in the ocean? So Professor Park response to that is that many offsets are outright fraudulent, and even of certified ones, few meet any standards of rigorous standards. So he says that rather than going for offsetting, we should think about whether our flights are necessary, and if not, reduce them and try and find alternatives. So let's move on to our third speaker, who will also be online, and that's Evelyn Madavar from the Max Planck Institute of Human, Cognitive and Brain Sciences, who will be discussing the role that diet plays in combating the climate crisis. So if we can play the video, please.
Okay, hello, I'm Evelyn, and I'm joining today from Leipzig, Germany, from my balcony, as I'm taking part in this meeting in the virtual way, because I decided not to fly or travel all the way to Glasgow. Coming up with some different perspective on the topic, how we can actually tackle the climate crisis, my talk will focus more on how can we integrate sustainability topics into our research, to a practical way in our research. And my topic will be, does the way to a sustainable mind go through the gut to the brain? And Why did I choose the topic? I want to give you some background on why this is such an important topic overall, but also for my personal interest. If we consider the environmental impact of global food production, you can see here that our food and agriculture sectors on a global scale contribute to about a fourth of global greenhouse gas emissions, 50% of land use, 70% of fresh water use, 80% of eutrophication potential, and over 90% of biodiversity loss. So the numbers and the impact is quite shocking overall, but this also means that there's quite a huge potential to reduce those numbers if we change something. Because if we go to a more individual scale here, we can see that the environmental impact for different diet types can also be quite different. So this is a simplified data graph from Alexandrovich, and we can see here in the bottom line that replacing beef and lamb with other meat already saves up to about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions related to your diet. If you further reduce animal-based content in the diet, for example in the vegan diet, there's about the reduction potential of 50% of greenhouse gas emissions related to individual diet. And these numbers are quite similar for land use and water use as well. So there's quite a potential to drop these numbers that we've seen on the slide before. And a different publication here from Clark et al. PNAS shows similar numbers. Here we see that in green, the plant-based ingredients compared to the colored ones, which are animal-based and sweetened, sugared beverages and olive oil, that the green food items, plant-based items, have a lower relative environmental impact compared to the others. But what is important here is they also assess the relative risk of disease. And that as well, the pattern kind of looks a bit similar, that the relative risk for disease is lower for the greener items. And if we put the two into perspective, we can actually see quite a nice association, showing that a higher relative risk of mortality also goes along with a higher relative environmental impact. And this, for example, here in red, you can see that this is quite high for meat, whereas for all the other green items, the plant-based ones, the relative risk is quite low and accompanied by rather relative environmental impact as well, clustering all in the lower left quadrant. Okay, so the take-home message here is that sustainable diets have co-benefits, and those can help to counter the twofold problem of the climate crisis and malnutrition. Okay, so why don't we then just all switch to vegan diets? Why is behavioral change so hard to achieve? This was a question I was asking myself before I started my PhD. And then in the process, you may know that in Europe, for example, there are about 3% of people following a vegan diet, yet this is growing in number. However, it's still quite a niche in the population. So I was asking, how do these people get to the sustainable mind? So why do they change their diet? And how do they maybe also feed it in the long run? How can they sustain their dietary choices in that way? So coming from this kind of a prompt idea before my PhD, I had then the task to put that into a test or a research question. So I kind of had to go from this very broad question and filtrate it down, distill it down to a very essential question of interest that one could put into a clinical trial. So basically about a year or so, I was preparing to design my own study. And I came across questions such as, would I look at dietary patterns versus single ingredients? Would I look at dietary change versus supplements? How would the people be informed already about dietary choice making? Would they rather be informed eaters versus naive eaters? Would I be interested in any metabolic subgroups of predispositions in that context? So would I look at normal weight versus overweight? Since we're in the neuroscience context of food decision-making, which neural correlate would I actually want to measure? And how would I measure it? Would I need a self-made fMRI task, or was there already an established task I could use? Would I be interested in high-level versus low-level fMRI contrasts? And then also, since we were targeting dietary intervention and looking at brain, I was of course also interested which mechanistic route would be then interesting to measure. And how to blind the study on both sides was a big question, and so on and so on. So there were many, many questions that from this quite of a, prompted everyday life question that I had to inspire my research had to be boiled down to a certain specific point. And this was a super inspiring and helpful process of about a year, as I said. So I can just encourage you to do it, just with a little bit of a hint that this may take longer, as when you're just following up on an already quite precise field of research that has been quite established. Okay. So what did we do and what did we find? So in our registered and pre-registered study, we came up with the following design. So it's a human dietary intervention study in a crossover within subject design. Participants were following 14 days of intervention, either fiber or placebo, interleaved with a washout period of 14 days. Before and after each condition, there was a full testing day, and this full testing day included biomarker sampling, a very long MRI session, and other measurements. And in this very long fMRI session, there was one fMRI task included where people were looking at stimuli. And those stimuli were food and art images. And we were actually in particular interested in the food wanting aspect. So participants saw the picture and they had to rate them on a scale from 1 to 8, how much they want this right now. For the art prints, it was the same, how much you want this right now, and they would then receive the food reward and the art picture and print after scanning. So we particularly decided to go for a high level contrasting primary reward of food versus secondary reward of art images that we created ourselves to kind of be able to depict this aesthetic pleasure. Okay, what did we find? In our pre-registered analysis, we could firstly see that our intervention worked well. So we were targeting the gut microbiome with the fiber intervention, showing that certain bacterial genera increased after 2 weeks already. So that was quite a massive effect. For our wanting ratings, we saw that food images were higher rated in wanting as art images, which was expected. And if we were looking at this behavioral data on the intervention effect, there was actually no interaction effect for food and art pictures. Yet, when we were looking at a higher resolution on specific food and art categories, we could find that after fiber intervention, the caloric quartiles 2 and 3 were higher rated and wanted than the 2 other caloric quartiles. What would be the correlate on the neural level? We were also, of course, very excited to see that data. And in this parametric modulation of wanting by caloric content in a linear way, 3 significant clusters emerged in the reward network. And those specifically were in the VTA and in the OFC. And in all 3 clusters, the activity diminished for higher wanted, higher caloric images. If you're interested in more details on the project, please come find my poster 2177. I can tell you all about it. Okay. Next to this super huge MRI study, of course, food decision making we know is mostly also, of course, influenced by other factors, external factors, and also maybe single meal choices would already be quite telling for us. So in a different project here in the Mensa study, we were looking at single meal choice and psychological factors in smartphone embedded studies and all of Germany and Austria, in university cafeterias, and we could actually track people with photos, and also we gave them emoji scales to rate their mood and hunger always before and after a meal. And this was quite an extensive study, and we were looking at different aspects of food decision making here as well, and you can find more details on that in the preprint. All data is also open. So the take-home message here is sustainable diets might be able to alter how we make food decisions at the moment of choice, but also maybe in future decision-making processes. So that's all great. I showed you one example of how one can come from an everyday life question into research projects on the topic of sustainability and sustainable food decision making. Yet, of course, there's also the other side of the coin, which is sustainable science itself. So how do we actually perform the science that we're doing? And to give you some ideas, and we were thinking about this quite a lot with my colleagues Simon and Gisela from our institute, and we published that in an opinion paper where we are arguing that there is a sustainability argument for open science implementation. And what exactly all of the different aspects of science and scientific activities, you can find in detail in the paper, but overall what we say is that open science is a super great tool to also reduce our environmental impact of research activities. So what can you do now in your research? So you can see this whole palette of open science practices. And I think the best part actually is that before a project, you really go and check practice by practice which one you can implement in your project. And then you can also carefully plan to implement those, have the right consent forms and everything well planned ahead. If you're already on project, I think you can still check and go through the different practices and see which ones you can still apply. For example, publishing strategy and others. Post-project, maybe your study is already out and published and you're looking back at your data from 4 or 5 years ago or so. I think you can still check which open science practices you can implement. Is there any way of opening up some data or materials or code you used at the time? And just to give you an idea of also how that happened to me in my project, so I showed you quite the streamlined, pre-registered type of analysis that we did beforehand. Yet, since this was quite a large project, we are also required to have quite some methodological advancements going on. And most of them, they were side projects, and none of these were pre-registered, as I said, but still, most of them could be published open access, and open material and open code would be provided in one or the other cases, always depending on the project itself. But I just want to highlight also that there is quite a potential, maybe also hidden in side projects. And all of this is nice and great, but of course our most important factors as neuroscientists is our way of traveling, but also in terms of methods, the most impactful method, of course, is neuroimaging. And since we cannot stop scanning, of course, I decided to estimate the CO2 emissions from different projects that I was running or taking part in. And just to give you an idea, like an average project of a certain size here, maybe normal size for neuroscience was about 3 tons of CO2, which is quite an amount of emissions. And since I couldn't really do anything about that, of course, I then decided to go for CO2 compensation in these 3 projects. So the take-home message here is that open science helps to do sustainable science. And just to finish up, I just wanted to give you again the 2 sides of the coin. So I really want to encourage you to reflect upon science and sustainability topics that interest you and that you can actually move from everyday life into a research context. And then also, of course, the sustainable side of the science. So how do we do science? How do we travel? But also just really practically, which methods do we use and how do we publish, etc. And with this, I'm at the end of my talk. I'm really happy for all of my colleagues and collaborators and all the initiatives I am taking part in, and I'm happy to receive your questions via chat. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a few questions for Evelyn, although first I'll amplify the message from the person that said that Glasgow has a lot of excellent vegan options, including the mighty Greg's sausage roll. So someone's asking, Evelyn, I've lost it. If diet is a personal choice, how do we as a society help people make sustainable and healthy choices? So Evelyn is responding. questioning whether it is indeed an individual choice as such, the diet, and pointing out that there's a responsibility within a society for policymakers to provide solutions, like changing the types of foods on offer in canteens, helping to subsidize foods that are more environmentally sustainable. And she points out that the study of the results of her study may hint towards an unconscious habituation towards high-calorie foods when eating more fiber-rich diets. And so potentially changing our diet would alter our subconscious responses to stimuli, food stimuli.
I can ask the next one.
Please.
Okay. So one of the questions is, Evelyn has not answered this one, but I can speak to this because we've had some discussions about this in the annual meeting working group that we have in our SIG. So someone asked, do you think it's likely that OHBM will go fully plant-based in the future, and can they aim to host venues with vegan food? That's actually something that we asked about. Unfortunately, for the next 3 years, the venues are already chosen, but as a SIG, we've drafted many letters to council, and many of which they've listened to, I think. Maybe not many, but we've drafted some responses to council about making this consideration for plant-based offerings and making sure that the conference venues that we choose have a majority plant-based offerings. And so that is something that we're working towards. But if there's anyone that to which this is a particular interest, please feel free to get in touch with us and join our SIG and help us with this effort, because it is something that we're actively trying to pursue.
Okay, and a final question for Evelyn. So the question was, does that mean we all have to become vegan? And Evelyn responds, no, basically, but that just introducing more plant-based food into one's diet is going to make a difference, both in a sustainability sense and in a sense of animal suffering. So no vegan, but maybe a couple of extra corn sausages. Okay, so let's move on to our final talk, which will be from Simon Hoffman, also from the Max Planck Institute of Human, Cognitive and Brain Sciences, who will be discussing how we can optimize our deep learning models to reduce their environmental impact. So, Simon.
Thanks. I hope you can hear me well. All right, just testing this. Yes, hello everybody, my name is Simon Hoffman. I'm also from the Max Planck, as you just heard. And I'm actually very, very delighted to being invited here for this symposium, which I think is very important, and I hope I can just put some humble thoughts and ideas into this. I think it's a very big topic, and maybe the talk will raise some discussions later. So my presentation, I guess, is also similar to Evelyn's presentation. It's also very much motivated by my own research, where I use deep learning models for neuroimaging. And over the last years, I more and more thought about how we can actually make these models more sustainable. As you all know, deep learning, or this umbrella term AI, conquered basically many fields, not only in the sciences, but also in industry. But besides this excitement, there's also a lot of critique that these models are very data hungry and computationally quite heavy, and usually also difficult to interpret. Nonetheless, I think also in the fields of neuroscience, I think we cannot reject this idea that these models are quite good in at least predicting tasks. So when you look, for example, in the domain of brain age predictions, we heard also at the OHBM a lot, they basically are state-of-the-art. Here, for example, Peng et al. Could show that their deep neural network had a mean absolute error of about 2.14 years. And they compared their model on the same data set to several other approaches, including more computationally efficient models like linear models, and even on a slow data regime, these models outperformed these more linear approaches. One common critique, as I mentioned already, is that these models are quite difficult to interpret because of the huge parameter space, which gives them often also this label of being a black box. And in my personal research, I'm quite interested to open this black box and to understand what these models actually look at in especially MRI images in order to make their predictions. And also just a small hint, we together with Ole Goltermann, we have a post on that, so it's today and tomorrow at 082. But even though model interpretability, you definitely could also consider as a sustainability topic, because if a model is not interpretable, it's not sustainable, obviously. I want to focus in this talk more on the energy consumptions of this model class. So in my research, I implemented or came up with these two architectures, or two forms of the same architecture, which are like multi-level ensembles of 3D convolutional networks, and as the name already suggests, they're quite heavy. I trained them on several MRI sequences from T1, FLAIR, SWI, in order to predict age. So the question is now how much energy actually these models consume. And when we concentrate now on the left-hand side, so the type 1 variant, basically, this consists of 30 base models, and each of these base models is one 3D convolutional network. Overall, this whole model, or this whole ensemble, has then more than, or approximately 55 million parameters, which are to be trained. And each of these base models in this ensemble I trained for 40 epochs. The training for one base model was more than 2 hours, which add up to about 72 hours of training time for one ensemble. And then there are some repetitions, and when you then when you take then these two architectures I have also for both architectures two configurations. I approximately ended up with about 1,740 hours of training time, which is immense. And there's this very nice tool which is called greenalgorithms.org, where you can basically plug in this training time and also your hardware configurations, and then see or like approximate your carbon footprint. Yeah, you receive also then some equivalents, for example, in air travel. And as we heard before, I mean, this is a major contribution to an individual's researcher carbon footprint. And when you compare that with the model training here on in the middle bottom, you see that's quite substantial. So knowing that these models are quite powerful when it comes to the prediction and the interest in the field of using them, obviously, the question is now like, how can we make them more sustainable? And the sustainability issue is not really an issue only about computational time, it's also about personal investment and engineering work. So for me personally, I spent like nearly all my PhD in developing these methods, testing them, fine-tuning them. So it's not only about computational time, but also about personal time. But one big benefit of these model classes is that they are quite generalizable. I keep this quite broad here, but I think this concept is shown in many studies. And when we use, when we take this, we can ask them how we can make these models more sustainable. And one goal would be definitely to recycle them. And make them ultimately also more easily applicable for wider research community and for other, new data sets and new tasks. And all this basically alludes to this idea of open source and open science. So recycling models works, for example, via transfer learning. And this idea of transfer learning is actually an old idea, especially also in the field of computer science. Already 1995, Trun talked or discussed in his paper, that there are kind of these lifelong learners which maybe benefit from being trained on several tasks and maybe transferred after being trained on several tasks to new tasks, and they can basically take learned features and knowledge basically to new tasks, which makes them then more data efficient. Also, after the third wave of AI, researchers looked into this again. Here, for example, Josinski et al. Could show that even when you use trained features from one to a distant task, this is better than training a model from scratch. And on the graph here, which is a bit idealized, obviously, you would expect for this curve, which is a transfer learning model, that you start ideally with a better performance already and then have a steeper learning curve and ideally also end up with a better performance in the end. And it's actually already done a lot, so it's not like that this is kind of something new, especially in the field of medical imaging, where data is often sparse and people have little access to data of certain pathologies or so. Researchers could show that they could even take deep learning models which were trained on naturalistic images like from ImageNet or so and transfer these models to medical data and which help their application. For example, Ding et al. Used this approach even on MRI data, so for Alzheimer's disease detection. There was also recently a bit more systematic view on this by Rago et al., where they, at least on the performance side, after training for a long time and on a lot of data, that's the ultimate performance benefits might be not so big, but which assumes that you have a lot of data and a lot of training time. But they definitely found also this steeper learning curve, so your models basically don't need to train as long in order to converge. And to give you just a small visual idea of how this works, so you can consider here on the top row a case where a deep neural network, like as I presented you before, is trained on a huge MRI data set on a certain task, for example, brain age estimations, which is a regression problem. And then you bring this model to a small data set where you have far less data and maybe a completely different research question. But the nice thing is that you can then take basically the bottom part of the model. Oops, doesn't really work. And take these learned weights to this new task and just replace basically the upper part of the model with a kind of fresh on top model. And obviously there are, like, I cannot go here into the technical details. Some of you might be also bored by them, but obviously there are also different flavors to that depending on how distant the new task is or how distant the new data set is. And next I want to actually propose maybe a bit more general idea, which is maybe a bit more speculative, but I think it would be interesting to talk about this. It's also basically picking these old ideas up of lifelong learning, and the idea would be maybe to train a model, like a large-scale model, as a whole community. And we can call this kind of model even like maybe the deep neuroscientist or so. And the idea would be to have or train somehow a new neuroimaging toolbox like SPM or so. And if you're not familiar with this concept, it's actually a very nice idea to think about it like this. It's nicely summarized in a blog post by Kapafi from 2017, talking about software 2.0. So the idea is not to hard code software in a program, but rather stating a certain optimization problem and then basically learn software from the data in order to solve this problem. One benefit can also be that, especially with medical data, that we often cannot share data, but we at least more easily can share models. where the data is maybe also represented in the model weights. And this, as I said also before, I mean, this whole idea alludes to this idea of open science and sharing models, sharing data. And as Evelyn in her previous talk mentioned already, we wrote together with a colleague, Gisela Hofert, an opinion piece on this, that there are actually quite good arguments for open science in terms of sustainability. So how could this look like, this kind of pipeline or this large-scale network? We could think about training this network on the big data sets which are out there already. There is also previous research which could show that these networks quite nicely generalize to unseen data from different recording sites. And then in an ideal workflow, an individual researcher can download this data from a public, the model from a public server, basically applies it on a small data set, trains the model further, and then basically re-upload the model into the cloud. And in some form of distributed validation step, this model update can be scrutinized further before we approve or decline or maybe adapt this update of the model. And obviously this could also, in terms of version control, also allows for different stages of this model. So to summarize, I think after a lot of years of model explosions and exploration, I mean, maybe it's time for consolidation and converge or unite a bit the efforts. We have seen that transfer learning is an essential tool, especially with this model class, to make these models reusable. There is definitely a need for better guidelines how to use transfer learning and when to use which or parameters or methods depending on how distant tasks are or how distant new data sets are. But maybe also one idea, as I just lastly mentioned, is to basically nurture a large-scale network as a community, which also actually picks up also current debates in the field of machine learning, where many leading researchers really advocate this idea of that it's all about scaling currently, which in a way might not sound sustainable because you think of the purely compute which is needed for training and using large-scale networks, but I think ultimately it has the potential to really create a more or less universal network which might be leads to more replicable and reproducible research workflows, and by that being also more sustainable than having these too many pipelines we currently all have, which are often offline or hardly shared. And with this, I want to thank you, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Okay, we've got time for squeeze in a couple of questions. So there's been a few people who've been asking about the potential privacy issues of sharing models, especially in particular in the case of medical data. So could you maybe expand a little more on that issue?
Sorry, I didn't get the last part of the question.
Could you just expand a little bit on the issue of privacy?
Oh, of the privacy, yeah. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, I think for me personally, I didn't perceive any really convincing science yet where kind of basically bringing these models to a new task where these privacy issues are of real relevance. I mean, by, for example, identifying certain subjects purely through model weights in such a network. But I'm very curious if people or whoever asked the question can come later and talk about this. I mean, ideally, it's you get through this model training and like the dimensional reduction by model training, you get a representation of a brain or of a population which is reduced and where you cannot identify certain individuals.
Okay, and finally, I think maybe just a question for some more detailed ideas of what as a community we could do in order to get pre-trained models more used. What kind of practical steps could we take?
What practical steps? I think what I at least realized in my own institutes, I think is there, or let's say it more broadly, I mean, I think there's amazing steps, fast steps done, like in the software community. They created amazing tools. I mean, most of us use currently also GitHub more and more to share at least the code of analysis code or so for our experiments. But there's like really amazing tools and workflows which we can adopt. There's also, for example, this website Hugging Face, which is a platform where you can share models and according data. And I think it's definitely something to be aware of and try to integrate that more in our workflows. And I think also broadly, I mean, it also alludes a bit to what also Evelyn picked up already, and with this idea of sharing and code and open science in general. I think it is really worth it to make this extra mile for the whole community. Like, write nice documentation, share your codes, be open. It might be for an individual the few extra meters you sometimes don't want to make, but in the community it's definitely a way towards a more sustainable workflow.
Okay, unfortunately we're out of time, so thank you again, Simon. And thank you to all of our speakers, and also to all of you for a lot of excellent questions. There were some questions that were for the SIG in particular, so if we weren't able to answer those, then please just come and grab one of us and we'll be happy to answer you. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending.
So much for the people that are in the SIG that have like put together so much hard work. You guys have done this just because you're really passionate about this, and I'm so impressed and amazed at the work that you've done to present this data here. So thanks so much, guys.